If you think that you can transform what we have already now into some kind of utopia, you're dangerous, because that isn't how the world works, and utopians have been more dangerous than any other people for the last 100 years. That's for sure. Like, there's all sorts of things wrong with Western society. Always, and there always will be. But compared to 85 to 90% of the rest of the planet, this is bloody heaven.
In the Black Book of Communism, it is estimated that 100 million people have died in communist regimes since 1917. You hear this all the time.
Communists killed 70 million people in China.
200 million people conservatively.
Well, obviously more than 100 million, because that's the approximate total. That's probably an underestimate.
Oh yes, especially from this guy. Capitalists use these figures to argue that capitalism is superior to socialism. I could respond by denying that these regimes were really socialist, or by arguing that far less people died under these regimes as capitalists claim. Instead, I'll assume for the sake of argument that these regimes really were socialist, and that the Black Book is correct and that 100 million people really did die. Does it follow then that capitalism is really superior? Only if capitalism has killed less. So let's do something that the right loves to go on about and compare the numbers.
How many millions of people have to die before you might admit that you're wrong?
In order to calculate the death toll of capitalism, we need to look at what capitalism is. It's an economic system based on the private ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange. So how many people in contemporary society, let alone across capitalism's long history, die due to this economic system? Capitalism is global, and around the world 8 million people die from lack of clean drinking water. Roughly another 8 million people die from hunger, and on top of that, another 3 million die from vaccine-treatable diseases. Adding in room for error, let's just take it to a grand total of 20 million deaths per year due to the lack of food, water, and vaccines. That puts the death count at over 1,600%. compared with the socialist regime. That's the show, thanks for watching, make sure you like and subscribe. If you want to, hit me up on Patreon, that would be really cool. Okay, thanks guys, bye! Wait a minute, I hear you ask. Why is that the result of capitalism? Well, I'm glad you asked. Under capitalism, production is organised to produce profit, that's just how it is, rather than satisfying people's needs. As a result, many people's needs are not met because there's no profit in doing so, despite the fact that we have more than enough resources for everyone on Earth to have a comfortable existence. The 20 million people who die each year are not dying because life just sucks and this is the way that things are. No, they die from very easily treatable problems. Right now we overproduce food. There's plenty available, and we waste a huge chunk of it anyway. We could cover the cost of providing water and sanitations if all Americans put the $10 billion they spend on ice cream each year into a giant money pot. But I'll be honest, the onus should not be on the little people to sacrifice ice cream for the welfare of others. That's the same logic as agreeing that taking in refugees, you on principle have to accept some of them into your house, when in reality governments should use the vast sums of money they have to house them. Likewise, if the top 5 business people gave a mere 10% of their money towards world hunger, or just 3% towards clean water, they would be more than eradicated. This should then make you ask, well, why don't they? Because it doesn't matter to them. Money and power matters to them. Millions more will starve every single year simply because capitalists care more about themselves and their stock portfolios than they do about real human beings. Capitalism is therefore not only an economic system in which production is organised to produce profit, it's also an economic system in which profit is valued more than humans. As a result, capitalists focus on making as much money for themselves and their shareholders irrespective of the human cost. To illustrate this line of thinking, let's imagine a man that owns a helicopter. There's been a natural disaster in Colombia. The hospitals have been destroyed and people need medical supplies ASAP. The helicopter man could give space in his ride to provide help to medical personnel, but reporters and news companies are offering him a lot more money, so he follows the capitalist logic and takes them instead in order to maximise his profits. Except, this isn't a thought experiment. It actually happened in 1985. Not only did this actually happen, but this way of thinking permeates our societies. Oddly, the mortality rate has actually increased in Russia since the collapse of the Soviet Union. In recent news, Grenfell Tower caught fire because the owners installed dangerous refurbishments that make it look prettier to the surrounding area, whilst ignoring all the calls for proper fire safety precautions to be installed. Yet, when this happens, people appear to be shunned for trying to politicise the occasion, despite the fact that it very much so is political.
As far as I can tell, it's not a political issue, or at least it shouldn't. It looks like it was a tragedy. There may be some corporate malfeasance involved. I'm sure the people who are responsible can be fined, can be tried, can be investigated, can be... whatever the requisite legal action is to take against these people can be taken, and unfortunately we'll just have to move on with our lives, because as far as I can tell, this seems to have just been an accident, right?
In many ways, this line of reasoning can be summed up in the idea of a billion lives matter less than the status quo and a billionaire's right to keep his profits. I mean, I know they're not going to do that anyway, but think about what the fuck you're saying. We don't look at this as evidence of capitalism's death toll. Instead we say, it's just a corrupt council. When similar things happen in Bangladesh, we just say it's idiotic management. Or worse, that these things just happen in the third world. So in other words, whenever I point out these examples of crimes committed by capitalists acting completely in their own interests, especially in Western multinational corporations, you will turn to me and say, that's not true capitalism, that's corporatism. Not this nice fancy form of capitalism that economists like Mises, Bastiat, Locke or Smith imagined. These same people will then go on to claim that capitalism is bringing millions of people from the third world out of poverty. But how can it be if we live under corporatism and not capitalism? You can't have it both ways. Western corporations don't bring wealth to the third world out of the kindness of their hearts. Corporations bring jobs simply because the labour in these countries is cheaper than in the first world, and so far more profitable. If people in those countries organised and won higher wages, then corporations would look elsewhere. Although, corporations would only do so after they tried their very best at violently crushing any emerging labour movement. In reality though, Western countries are not bringing wealth to the third world. The long and short of it is, capitalism doesn't care about externalities. If somebody starves, no matter. It would only matter to them if they were profitable in the market. If we already have enough people working in our jobs and factories, then why economically should we give them aid? After all, if I give my money and wealth away to these people myself, then that's going to be a disadvantage to my bottom line. So much death, and we haven't even mentioned war yet, which is arguably minor by comparison. Wars and misery that have been spread through the ages and devastated lives, all for the same principles that we hold to be the status quo. Production, distribution, exchange. All these disasters against humanity link straight back to their interests.
Like, there's all sorts of things wrong with Western society. Always, and there always will be, but compared to 85 to 90% of the rest of the planet, this is bloody heaven.
A heaven, Jordan. Built on blood and conquest for the preservation of a few, by the expense of the many. That's some heaven. In the Black Book of Communism, 100 million are said to have died. In the past 5 years, capitalism has eclipsed that. Just one last point. You may be thinking that this is unfair, considering that socialist states had less people than capitalist ones. Well, let's just say that all 7 billion people in the world now live under socialism. Compare that to real-life socialist state population comes to roughly about 1 billion if we're generous. In reality, that's about 1.25 million people dying every day for 80 years to get to 100 million. Now times that by 7, it comes to 700 million. Now this is of course a rough calculation and neglects the different conditions for each country, but even if this were accurate, that's still far less than half.